Everyone knows that the best thing in fantasy football is hitting on an absolute sleeper. And I've got some sleepers for you guys today, but these are not, average everyday sleepers. These are deep, deep, deep guys. In fact, probably guys who are not even getting drafted in a ton of your leagues, but all guys that I think are going to impact fantasy football in 2025. And of course, we are going to begin with my boy, Brashard Smith for the Kansas City Chiefs. As it stands right now, I am not anticipating Elijah Mitchell to make the roster. Neither is The Athletic, showing that Elijah Mitchell and Carson Steele probably get cut. As The Athletic notes, Smith, a former receiver in college, should be more of a wideout/running back hybrid player, as opposed to someone who will be asked to line up and take carries out of the backfield. You can see that reflected in his profile at SMU. Almost 1,400 receiving yards his final season at SMU. That's his first season playing running back. 43% breakaway rate. He was really strong in the preseason as a rusher. Of course, everyone saw that highlight of him bouncing off the defensive lineman, turning around, cutting upfield, getting a 10-yard gain. He played 2 snaps with Mahomes in the final dress rehearsal game for the Kansas City Chiefs. How many targets did he get? 2. 2 snaps, 2 routes, 2 targets. I think that there's a very strong chance that Brashard Smith is this year's Jerick McKinnon for the Kansas City Chiefs. Of course, everyone remembers that 9 receiving touchdown season that McKinnon had in 2022. I would say if you take nothing away from my channel this offseason, it would be keep Brashard Smith on the front of your brain as a real fantasy football sleeper. Let's move on to a guy that I have a little bit lower degree of confidence in. I was thinking about what is a sleeper wide receiver? Who is a guy who could actually break out? And I think that Roman Wilson does hit this category. Of course, he is playing for a team that in our minds, we think, well, there's no way the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to throw enough passes for there to be a sleeper wide receiver. But depending on whose projections you look at, I tend to go off Mike Clay's quite a bit because he's very conservative. And I think for someone like me, that kind of helps me rein in my expectations for the upcoming season. He actually has Aaron Rodgers for 562 pass attempts. I checked a couple other projection sources. They're not far off from that. And you can give DK Metcalf as many targets as you want. You could give this dude 200 targets, and there's still enough meat on the bone for one other guy to be impactful in this offense. Now, it could be Jonnu Smith. It could be Pratt Freiermuth. I'm betting not, though. I really like the concept of Roman Wilson, who was very good at Michigan, a 38% dominator rating his final season there, 21% of Michigan's total touchdowns in 2023, generated, it doesn't seem like a lot, 789 receiving yards, but remember, this was famously the Michigan team that got J.J. McCarthy drafted in the first round, despite not being a heavy passing offense. He came into the combine, ran a 4.39. No, Davis, why do you like Roman Wilson? He didn't play it all last year. Well, I think the Steelers are one of those teams, particularly the 2024 iteration of the team, that a guy who started as slow as Roman Wilson did with an ankle injury, I believe Roman Wilson in the NFL only played special teams as a rookie, and that's why he does not really get drafted at all. And I think that is totally reasonable and viable. But Calvin Austin is just way too small as an NFL player. I mean, Roman Wilson is not big at 185, but Calvin Austin has been around the NFL, been around the Steelers for a while. He's purely a situational deep threat. He has played 2 seasons. He's generated 88 targets, 728 yards, and 5 touchdowns. I think that Calvin Austin can kind of stay in that sacrificial X style role. Roman Wilson could kind of evolve himself into sort of, if you're thinking about the way an Aaron Rodgers offense works, kind of like a hybrid of the old James Jones role with what Randall Cobb used to do, because Metcalf is purely stuck on the perimeter, right? We know that. And we know in an Arthur Smith offense, there's going to be a lot of 12, but I do really like the idea of Roman Wilson in this offense, and I think that I think that it's something that we should continue to pursue. And you don't even have to draft him, right? Roman Wilson, you don't even have to draft. You can leave him on the bench. Now, a guy I would be interested in drafting, particularly because I think there's a chance that Adam Thielen does get traded when rosters cut down to the Minnesota Vikings. Diana Rossini said that it was unlikely, but Schefter reported that the Vikings had made some calls. Jalen Coker last season only generated 45 targets, but he generated 1.72 yards per route run. Now, this includes some games where he was purely sacrificial Xing, far better than his 33rd overall pick teammate, Xavier Legette. That was with a higher ADOT, around 11.4. And Coker has been drawing rave reviews all offseason. Sort of an interesting style of prospect because he was so lowly drafted. You know, the guy went to Holy Cross of all places, and when was not a highly recruited guy coming out of high school, but he was awesome at the combine. 4.5740 at 210 pounds, generated a 42.5 vertical, generated a 10.8 foot broad jump, and it's so unlikely for undrafted free agents to make rosters. And then on top of that, to end up playing. Like a lot of times what you'll see with an undrafted free agent wide receiver is that they will make the roster, but then they're only going to contribute on special teams. Guys like David Moore, who is on the Panthers, or someone like that will end up playing. So it's very impressive for Jalen Coker to work himself into the rotation. You can see projections not super bullish, right? Way behind Leggett, way behind Thielen. But both of those situations can remedy themselves almost immediately. Coker can just play better than Xavier Leggett. And in fact, my guess of reading the tea leaves in the preseason is that the Panthers coaching staff already thinks that he is better than Xavier Leggett, and that is why they would be comfortable trading Adam Thielen. It's why they would even engage with the Minnesota Vikings about that trade. Now, in like a 10-team, 12-team league, do you need to draft Jalen Coker? I mean, unless your league is 18 rounds, then you probably don't. But these are the sorts of guys who I really want to pay attention to, because Bryce Young last year, for as fun as he was for fantasy football, he still never threw for more than 240 yards in a game. He still, quote unquote, broke out with 6.6 yards per pass attempt. But if Bryce Young takes a leap and these projections that you were looking at end up being conservative, I would think that one of the biggest beneficiaries would be Coker, because we know what McMillan is going to do. McMillan is going to get 1,000 yards in between 4 and 9 touchdowns. Maybe he gets to 1,200 yards if he's truly incredible and Bryce Young really breaks out. But again, there is meat on the bone for a second wide receiver to break out here. And I'm not saying to never take Thielen. Thielen has a time and a place on this offense, but I do think that Coker is sort of the definition of a deep, deep sleeper, someone that your buddies might not even know about. I guess he does have a fun name, so your buddies might know about him. And then I'm going to give you guys a bonus one here. His teammate, Trevor Etienne, who was drafted out of Florida. Of course, that is Travis Etienne's little brother. Decent combine performance, generated a 4.4240 at 200 pounds. His RotoViz comps are sort of interesting. You have Devonta Freeman, Mike Davis, and Chris Thompson all in there. Chris Thompson was actually a huge hit. If you go to the second tab, you actually have some guys who, interestingly enough, were like pure rushers in like Tank Bigsby. But then you also have receiving backs like CJ Prosise and Michael Carter. I tend to think that Etienne was drafted in the 4th round. Ben Gretsch originally made this point that Etienne was drafted ahead a lot of other running backs that we do like, or drafted very similarly to other running backs that we do like Byshell Tootin or Jaden Blue. And Etienne was a pretty strong rusher, generated a 31% breakaway rate for a team that was trying to be serious. 3.43 yards after contact average. Was actually a pretty strong pass catcher when he played at Florida as well. In fact, he had 50 receptions his final 2 seasons in college if you combine them, which is quite strong. And again, if we look at this backfield, we have 61 targets there for Chuba Hubbard and 28 for Rico Dowdle. But it is my estimation, it is my guess that the reason why the Panthers sort of unexpectedly spent a 4th round pick on what is ostensibly their 3rd running back is, one, they don't really trust Chuba Hubbard on passing downs. And I think last year, Chuba Hubbard's usage would absolutely back that up. They were playing Miles Sanders, who might not even make the 2025 edition of the Cowboys on 3rd downs. They gave him 250 rushes, but only 54 targets. Compare that to 55 rushes for Miles Sanders and then 30 targets. They also were playing Mike Boone on some 3rd downs as well. I think they want to have a pass catching back there, and I don't really think they trust Rico Dowdle. $3.5 million, again, not a huge vote of confidence. That's the same thing that Eli Mitchell got, and we are about to cut Eli Mitchell from the Kansas City Chiefs. So I think, again, We're talking waiver wire speed dial. Like these are deep sleepers. These are guys who are outside the top 200 players in fantasy, in Trevor Etienne, Jalen Coker, Roman Wilson, and Rashard Smith, all of whom I think can potentially end up mattering for fantasy football this year. A reminder, we are sponsored by Drafters. You can use promo code Davis over on Drafters to get a deposit bonus. A link to that is in the description. Their main event contest is going to overlay, I think, pretty significantly. So I hope to see you guys over in that contest. Make sure you like the video. Make sure you're subscribed for daily fantasy football videos. And I will see you guys all back tomorrow.